Tonight at 10, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is a free woman after nearly 6 years in detention in Iran. She boarded a flight out of the country to the relief of her husband and daughter and is due to arrive at RAF Brize Norton in the next couple of hours.
Homecoming's a journey, not an arrival. I don't think it will just be today. There will be a whole process, and hopefully we'll look back in years to come and be a normal family, and you know, this will be a chapter in our lives, but there are many more chapters to come.
Another British Iranian, Anoushi Ashuri, detained for more than 4 years, is also heading back to the UK.
Also tonight, here in Ukraine, Russia goes on attacking key cities, even as peace talks continue. Ukrainian officials say a theatre in Mariupol that was being used as shelter for civilians has been destroyed. Russia denies attacking it. Russia counts its dead in the war as Vladimir Putin insists the invasion is going to plan. And Boris Johnson in Saudi Arabia wants fresh oil and gas supplies to reduce the West's reliance on Russia.
And coming up in the sports on the BBC News Channel, we'll have all the reaction as Liverpool lock horns with Arsenal, looking to cut Manchester City's lead at the top of the Premier League to a point.
Good evening. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is due to arrive back in the UK in the next couple of hours, having been released from detention in Iran after nearly 6 years. Her husband, Richard Ratcliffe, says he's deeply grateful for her release and that he and their daughter, Gabriella, are looking forward to a new life. Mrs. Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who has dual British and Iranian nationality, had been detained since 2016, originally accused of spying, then charged with plotting to overthrow the Iranian government. She's always strenuously denied the allegations. Another dual national, Anoushi Ashuri, is also returning to the UK after being released. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, says Britain has now settled an outstanding £400 million debt with Iran dating back to the 1970s. Our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley has the story.
The sheer relief, the joy are written all over her face. This is the moment Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and her relatives have dreamt of for almost 6 desperate years. Gratitude for those that made it happen as she arrived from Tehran in Oman. And then she boarded another plane carrying her back to the UK and her excited family.
You know, it's going to be the beginning of a new life, a normal life. Hopefully a happy family, and there'll be bumps, no doubt, and all the normal squabbles we had before. But yeah, I think we're really looking forward to seeing them.
Gabriella was not yet 2 when her mother was arrested. Now she's nearly 8. There've been so many false dawns for the family that Richard says she won't believe this is real until she's back in her mother's arms.
There's a recovery process. You can't get back the time that's gone. That's a fact. But we live in the future, not in the past. So you know, we'll take it one day at a time.
Day after day, week after week, Richard Ratcliffe waged a tireless campaign for Nazanin, working around the clock, and last year went on hunger strike for nearly 3 weeks, an act of desperation to pressure the government to do more to get her home. He's always said she was being held as a bargaining chip to get the UK to pay its long-standing military debt.
I think it's wonderful news, and I think that we must always realise that sadly the regime in Tehran is capable of holding people in this way. I think people do need to recognise that, and I'm glad that after a great deal of UK diplomacy, we've been able to get her out, get her back to her family.
It was back in April 2016 when Nazanin was arrested as she prepared to leave for London after visiting her parents. Months of solitary confinement followed, along with blindfolded interrogations and psychological torture. In September that year, an Islamic Revolutionary Court judge sentenced her to 5 years in jail at a secret trial. She's accused of working against the Iranian government. And last spring, when she'd completed that sentence, she's immediately sentenced again to another year in jail on charges of propaganda against the regime. But finally today she's heading home, along with Anoushi Ashuri, a retired engineer arrested in 2017 while visiting his elderly mother. He was serving a 10-year sentence for alleged spying, also after an unfair trial.
We bought him his favourite beer and...
His daughter Elika told me the family had also got in champagne and cake and could hardly believe the news.
It's been nearly 5 years of being inside a prison cell. So to suddenly, in a matter of 24 hours, have that turn around completely and to come back to normal life is very daunting as well as it is amazing. So, you know, we still have challenges ahead, but we're going to face it together as a family.
There'll be adjustments too for Nazanin and her family, who haven't been all together for 6 long years.
Homecoming's a journey, not an arrival. I don't think it will just be today. There'll be a whole process, and hopefully we'll look back in years to come and be a normal family, and you know, this will be a chapter in our lives, but there are many more chapters to come.
Doing a nice hair, eh?
This is how it's been for the past few months. Precious moments of parenting from thousands of miles away. But very soon now, she'll be back home with them. Richard says she'll want him to make her a nice cup of tea and perhaps to tidy the flat. Caroline Hawley, BBC News.
Well, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's release comes after years of campaigning and diplomacy by her family and British ministers, and crucially, the payment, as we've just been hearing, of that long-standing debt that Britain owed Iran. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
It's now almost 6 years since Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was arrested at Tehran airport. Repeated attempts to secure her release failed. So why's she been freed now? Ultimately, it's because Iran's Revolutionary Guards and judges have decided they no longer need to keep her hostage to put diplomatic pressure on the UK. And that's in part because the UK has paid Iran a long-standing debt. Britain owed Iran money for tanks sold in the 1970s but never delivered after the revolution. The UK feared paying the debt would fund terrorism and breach sanctions. But in a deal finessed by the Gulf state of Oman, £393 million was finally transferred to Iran today. Money the government claims will be used for humanitarian purposes, thus avoiding the risk of sanctions.
It isn't a ransom, it's a debt. And the point about debt is, first of all, we're a country that pays our debts. And secondly, if you owe a debt, then you have to pay it whoever you owe it to.
Mrs Zaghari-Ratcliffe's also been released because of diplomatic efforts. Above all, by her husband, using everything from publicity to hunger strikes to put pressure on Iran and British ministers, who did not always help matters, such as when Boris Johnson told MPs this.
When you look at what Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was doing, it's just, you know, she was simply teaching people journalism, as I understand it.
This was a false claim, and it was used against Mrs Zaghari-Ratcliffe repeatedly on state media. But other foreign secretaries kept up the pressure, like Jeremy Hunt, who visited Iran in 2018, and then finally Liz Truss, who sent teams of diplomats to Iran to do a deal.
What has changed in the last 6 months is we do have a new government in Iran. And I was able, when I went to New York in September and met Minister Abdollahian, to reset the relationship and be clear that we were serious about resolving the outstanding issues that Iran had, and they were clear they were serious about resolving the outstanding issues we had.
She also met her counterpart from Oman, who played a key mediation role, facilitating the payment of Britain's debt through his country's central bank.
I really hope what has been achieved here may stand as a beacon for future progress, and not just in the relationship between the UK and Iran, but also in international relations.
Certainly, broader international relations did also play a role. Iran's economy has been struggling under international sanctions, less able to trade and sell oil, penalties it wants to see lifted as part of negotiations to secure a new deal, curbing the country's nuclear activities. That agreement's hanging in the balance, and releasing detainees could help. For 6 years, politics kept Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe apart from her family. Now it's played a part in her release. James Landale, BBC News.
Our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley is here. I mean, it is hard to imagine what Nazanin and her family have been through over the last 6 years. Happy days now, obviously, but they've been to hell and back, no question.
Today is an incredible day for everyone involved. The families always said that they were being held as hostages over that debt that Britain owed. The debt was paid and now they are home, or almost home. Nazanin looks so well in those pictures, but she really has been through an unimaginable ordeal. Intense psychological pressure, particularly at the beginning when she was in solitary confinement. She was interrogated. She was told that Richard had left her, when in fact he was waging that extraordinary campaign to get her freed. She suffered hair loss, depression, PTSD. She was taken at one point to hospital. And Anousheh Shouri was in such mental torment in jail that he actually tried to take his own life. And he went straight from a dirty prison cell to the airport to come home. Now, the latest we have is that flight bearing them will arrive at RAF Brize Norton in a couple of hours' time. And just imagine how everyone's feeling at the moment. There'll be emotional reunions and then the task of trying to rebuild their lives.
Indeed. It's a good day. All right. Caroline, thank you. Caroline Hawley there. Now, we're going to get the very latest on the situation in Ukraine, and Reeta is live in the western city of Lviv for us tonight. Over to you, Reeta.
Clive, thank you. Well, here in Ukraine, attacks by Russian forces have continued 3 weeks into the war, even as both sides talk of possible compromise. In the besieged southern port city of Mariupol, the authorities say that Russia has bombed a theatre used as a shelter for hundreds of civilians. There's no word yet on casualties, and Russia denies the attack. And in the capital, Kyiv, the emergency services said Russia had shelled a residential building. The city is currently observing a 35-hour curfew. Although Russian troops have pushed forward towards the outskirts of the capital, their progress in the north has been slower than in the south. They face serious logistical problems, with many vehicles reportedly running out of fuel, as well as strong Ukrainian resistance. Our first report this evening is from Jeremy Bowen in Kyiv, and a warning: it contains some flashing images.
Just after dawn, another attack hit a residential area in Kyiv. Ukrainian forces say they're keeping Russian artillery out of range, but missiles can be fired from Russia, and they are harder to stop. It was another harsh day. In the besieged city of Mariupol, a theatre was hit where the deputy mayor says civilians were sheltering. It isn't yet clear how many were in there when it was destroyed. And by mid-morning in Kyiv, sirens and smoke on the horizon from a Ukrainian counterattack, trying to push back the stalled Russian offensive to the northwest. That was why there was a curfew, making it impossible to check out the sounds of battle. Ukraine's President Zelensky dropped more hints about a ceasefire. But decisions, he said, had to be in Ukraine's interest. Perhaps the missile attacks on Kyiv are to pressure Ukraine to offer concessions for a ceasefire. So far, the attacks are isolated, threatening how bad it could get. For residents cleaning up before the curfew, even a single missile is terrifying. I'm so stressed, she says, I can't even tell you anything. I'm still shaken. But really big tests of Ukrainian resolve in the capital have not yet happened. More missiles could be that test. Ukraine's will to resist, though, is still strong. Workshops have switched to war production, strengthening fortifications. The Ukrainians say they're part of the reason why Russian troops are not able to break into Kyiv. This was filmed before the curfew. What they're working on here is a tyre ripper. The idea is that anyone driving over this will get their tyres destroyed, and they've even got little extra bits that go into the tyre to make it even worse. After 3 weeks, is a ceasefire possible? If not, will Russia punish this city? Would that break Ukraine's will to fight? Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Kyiv.
Well, Vladimir Putin has insisted that the invasion of Ukraine is going to plan, but he's admitted that sanctions are inflicting economic pain on Russia. There's a human cost being paid there too, with thousands of soldiers being sent to Ukraine to fight in President Putin's war. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg has been to one military funeral in the west of the country.
In Russia, they are grieving too. Mikhail was killed in action in Ukraine. Angelika is his widow. How many Russian soldiers have been killed in what the Kremlin still refuses to call a war? One family's pain is being repeated across the country. It's a criminal offence in Russia to quote anything but official figures. And those are 498 Russian servicemen dead. That was on March the 2nd. There has been no update for 2 weeks. Many Russians rally around their leader in times of crisis. It's as if they don't want to believe their president may have taken a fatal decision. We're doing the right thing, Nikolai says. NATO wanted to set up shop right next to us in Ukraine, and they've got nuclear weapons. Well done, Putin, for stopping them. The Kremlin wants Russians to believe that what their troops are doing in Ukraine is both necessary and heroic. It's what the state media is telling them from morning till night. Because if people stop believing that in large numbers, they'll start wondering why sons, brothers and husbands have been sent into Ukraine for what's being called here the special military operation. Father Iwan is wondering why. He recently delivered an anti-war sermon, and he criticised the Kremlin's offensive on the church website. He was detained and fined under a new law for discrediting the Russian armed forces.
I believe that any bloodshed, however you try to justify it, is a sin. Blood is on the hands of the person who spilled it. If an order was given, it's on the hands of whoever gave the order, supported it, or stayed silent.
On his final journey, full military honours for soldier Mikhail. His country calls him a defender of the fatherland. And yet it was Russia's army that attacked Ukraine on the orders of President Putin to restore Russian power and to force Ukraine into Russia's orbit. But at what cost? Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Kostroma.
The war here in Ukraine has had many countries reappraising their reliance on Russian energy. And today Boris Johnson, on a visit to the Middle East, held talks with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to try to increase oil and gas supplies. He's told the BBC that the West must never again be vulnerable to Vladimir Putin's blackmail. Some MPs have criticised the trip because of Saudi Arabia's human rights record, but the Prime Minister says the UK won't just turn a blind eye to abuses. Our political editor Laura Kunsberg is travelling with the Prime Minister.
Politicians don't just drop in for social calls, and they can't always pick who to stand alongside or how the national anthem is played. The Prime Minister wants to starve Russia of rubles, which means phasing out their oil and gas. The Saudi Crown Prince has the power to turn the taps on, but asking him means leaning on a controversial ally whose human rights record is so often condemned, at a moment when democratic values around the world are so under attack.
How can part of the solution be going to a country, a regime like Saudi Arabia, that has just executed more than 80 of its citizens, that has a questionable record on women's rights, on gay rights. How can you be comfortable with that?
The UK has a historic and long-standing relationship with Saudi Arabia, which goes back many, many decades, and that's not going to disappear.
But are you really comfortable?
And I'm not going to pretend that it is easy to have those conversations, but we have to do it, and we have to look at the progress that we are making with that relationship in driving green investment in the UK. And making sure that we were able to have energy security for the people of this people of Britain.
So basically, it's worth it. You don't like it, but it's worth it.
So I want to be clear. We don't just turn a blind eye. We don't wink at them. We don't ignore it. We raise it, and we make the argument.
The two men talked for so long, the staff had to wait. An hour and 45-minute conversation included human rights, but it's not clear exactly what was said. And after some obvious confusion, the pair did emerge to sign an agreement. Not for more oil straight away, but a promise to work more closely together and more investment announced today. Yet the opposition's asking questions about the company Mr Johnson keeps.
I think everybody wants to see measures to bring the energy bills down, but going cap in hand from dictator to dictator is not an energy strategy. The Prime Minister's saying we can't rely on Russia, so now he goes to Saudi Arabia.
But hard thinking is needed, not just clocking up air miles to untangle military, economic, diplomatic clashes that haven't just built up overnight.
If you look back at 2014 and what happened when Putin took part of Crimea, Ukraine then, took Crimea and the Donbass, we totally failed to understand the threat that he posed.
And you believe Ukraine is paying the price for that, the West looking the other way.
I totally agree. And so what we need to do now is make sure that the West is never again vulnerable to Putin's blackmail. I think the reality is that in one important sense, Putin has already failed. In that he did not understand what he would encounter when he sent his troops
bombing Ukrainian men, women and children
into Ukraine. He didn't understand the strength of their resistance. What Putin needs to realize is that he cannot now succeed. He won't be able to crush and conquer Ukraine because they've shown fundamentally that they have an indomitable spirit.
Yet the world already looks so different. Alliances shifting, unknown possibilities hang in the air. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Riyadh.
The US President Joe Biden has for the first time called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. It came after he announced a further $800 million of military aid to Ukraine. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky used a rare live address to the US Congress to make an emotional appeal for more help from America to fight off the Russian invasion. Our North America editor Sarah Smith has more.
Straight to the heart of American democracy, a plea for the US to defend democratic freedom.
Slava Ukraina!
A hero's welcome, but these lawmakers will not answer his pleas for a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
Is this a lot to ask for, to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine to save people? Is this too much to ask?
Showing a video of brutal Russian bombardment, Zelensky drew a direct comparison with Pearl Harbor and 9/11, times when the US was attacked from the skies. Then speaking in English to appeal directly to the US president.
You are the leader of the nation, of your great nation. I wish you to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace.
With this impassioned plea, President Zelensky is challenging President Biden to defend the very idea of democracy against autocracy, increasing the pressure on the US to do more to support Ukraine. But Biden is adamant. To impose a no-fly zone would risk escalating this conflict into a world war.
What's at stake here are the principles that the United States and the United Nations and across the world stand for. It's about freedom. It's about the right of people to determine their own future. It's about making sure Ukraine will never be a victory for Putin.
Later, and for the first time, he called Putin a war criminal.
Oh, I think he is a war criminal. Will you be meeting with us?
Signing over an additional $800 million of military assistance for Ukraine. Hundreds of portable surface-to-air Stinger missiles have already been sent there, with many more on the way, along with anti-tank weapons, guns and ammunition to help defend against Russian attacks. The US is promising a total of $13 billion for Ukraine in weaponry and humanitarian aid. There is a deep cross-party commitment to help as much as possible, but also a firm resolve that US forces or aircraft will not, cannot get involved in this conflict. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Washington.
Let's now join our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who's in Kyiv for us. And Lise, there are signs tonight that a diplomatic solution might be found, but this comes amid the bombing of a theatre in Mariupol used to shelter civilians.
Yes, this war is intensifying on many fronts, including here in Kyiv and, yes, around the besieged city of Mariupol. But the diplomacy is intensifying in many capitals. Even the veteran Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, often known for his caustic remarks, today spoke of concrete wording which would soon be agreed. But both sides have very thick red lines. The Financial Times has written about a 15-point plan which centres on Ukraine renouncing forever any ambition to join NATO in exchange for security guarantees. But what kind of guarantees would be acceptable to both? Ukraine is still insisting that Russia withdraw from all of the territories it occupied during this invasion. It is very hard to see that happening, particularly in the south. And today, President Putin emphasized again, vowing that he would achieve all of his aims. Never mind that large swathes of Ukraine are now smoldering ruins, and that the impact on civilians has reached what the UN Secretary General calls terrifying proportions. And so it was tonight again in Mariupol, where a theatre housing more than 1,000 people, including women and children, came under attack. And there were big white signs on the theatre saying, "Children."
Lise, thank you. That's Lise Doucette reporting from Kyiv. Well, that is all from me in Lviv. Time now to go back to Clive in the studio in London.
Reeta, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, the conflict in Ukraine has seen skyrocketing prices globally for basic commodities like fuel, fertiliser and food. Businesses here are calling for help from the Chancellor ahead of next week's spring statement, as Simon Jack reports now from South Shields in Tyne and Wear.
As cheap as chips, that doesn't quite ring true when you look at the prices of what goes into making this British favourite. It's a story of food price inflation in a box. Since last year, the price of white fish, of which Russia is a major supplier, is up 50%. The price of potatoes is up 30% and headed higher. And even peas have seen a 100% increase in price. And the energy to cook it, a whopping 400% Russia-related rise to businesses who are not protected by a price cap. Owner Richard Ord says many local chippies won't survive.
I've seen hundreds of shops already that haven't been able to cope with the price increases, and unfortunately things are actually getting worse. The sooner we can get something sorted with the price increases, the better, or we're going to see a lot of your local fish and chip shops gone.
It's a similar story in the supply chain.
By this afternoon, these will be down to chip shops and restaurants all over the north of England.
Potato grower Mark Robson is cutting back production and won't be sowing in this field.
Straight away the fertiliser has tripled, electric has tripled, the haulage has not doubled, but it's certainly going to be there very shortly. You know, we will definitely lose money if we planted this year. I dread to think what you'd lose on this one little field.
There's sunshine on the coast, but the outlook for businesses and their customers seems bleak. The war in Ukraine seems a long way away from this beach in South Shields, but the soaring price of potatoes, fish, oil, the energy to cook them is in part due to that conflict. It's causing a cost of living and a cost of doing business emergency, which has very much arrived on these shores. And the firms we work for, whose products and services we buy, are now desperate for some kind of financial lifeline. But adding to the burden on companies and consumers is a planned £12 billion tax hike in April. The Chancellor needs to change course at his spring statement next week, according to business chiefs.
Increasing costs are coming from every side: raw materials, energy, labour costs. I mean, it's a perfect storm. So we've got two key asks for the Chancellor. One is delay the national insurance increases that are coming in April, and let's find a way to protect businesses from at least some of the energy price rises with an SME price cap.
The government tonight said it recognised the impact gas prices are having on businesses and is looking for the best ways to support them. This global crisis is making economic and political waves right here at home. Simon Jack, BBC News, South Shields.
Despite continued speculation about the future of Chelsea Football Club, they're through to the quarter-finals of the Champions League. Formula One season gets underway this weekend with the opening Grand Prix in Bahrain on Sunday. It comes after a dramatic end to last season when Max Verstappen controversially pipped Lewis Hamilton to the title. Our sports correspondent Natalie Perks has been speaking to the reigning champion in Dubai.
He'd always eyed the world title, but for Max Verstappen, finally seeing his name in lights was far from straightforward. With Mercedes Sir Lewis Hamilton closing in on his 8th world title, a crash brought a hugely contentious end to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix that ultimately saw Verstappen crowned champion. The title was deserved, but the fallout is still fresh.
When you were a kid, you must have obviously dreamt of that moment of winning a world championship. How has the reality matched the fantasy?
Of course, you know, I said to myself, one day I want to become a world champion, but then I never really thought about it, about how I need to celebrate or whatever it's going to be like. So nobody could have predicted how the whole season would go.
The way it happened, did that take any of the shine off that moment for you?
Nah, it didn't. I mean, you have to look at it through the whole season. And I think overall it was just an amazing season for everyone and a very tough and you know, demanding season as well. So then it's even more rewarding to win it.
Had you allowed yourself at that point to think that it was over?
You know, if we're going to lose it, I don't want to make it look too easy, right? So I just kept pushing, I kept trying everything I could, but then of course, yeah, I didn't really think about a miracle or whatever, but luckily, of course, it happened.
And do you have any sympathy for Lewis with the way things ended, if you'd have been in his shoes?
I think which can heal the pain a little bit more is that he's won already 7, you know, yeah.
Do you think it's really time now for the sport to heal? Is this a really good opportunity to do that?
I think the sport doesn't need to heal. I mean, those are just dramatic moments which are part of the sport as well.
Who do you look at the moment in that paddock and think, I've got my eye on you?
The ones who look very comfortable and always quick is definitely Ferrari, but I mean, we're sure that Mercedes will be there as well.
Lewis says they're not competitive.
Look at every article from 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, it's the same story. So they will be there.
What does that first championship mean to you?
It's what you always wanted to achieve in the sport. And of course, I hope I can win more, but it's very important to at least win one.
Max Verstappen there speaking to Natalie Perks. And that's it. Now on BBC One, time for the news where you are. Have a very good night.